What's so unique about this first wave? Mass immigration in a short time period.
The jostle was horrendous. Hundreds of thousands of people were trying to board the ships. The view was so dull and deserted that Kutepov involuntarily uttered an exclamation, "Is that all?"
Some of them worked as doorkeepers, others would cut wood and bring it to the town.
The officers would engage in physical work here. They would load sleepers.
The face of modern Belgrade is largely the work of Nikolai Krasnov.
Nicholas II called her the Nightingale of Kursk. We do not know the fact that the Russians had a priority in comic books.
The Russian immigrants had no passports. I mean, they did, but those had been issued by the country that no longer existed.
Hired an Italian freighter that rammed the boat and sunk it.
They all lived out of suitcases because they hoped that they would be able to return to their homeland.
It feels like this 100-year gap vanishes right away when viewed up close. Hello, dear friends. We are in Berlin, a city which has become one of the centers of Russian immigration, as you might know. Again, like it was 100 years ago. When, according to different figures, from 1.5 million up to 3 million Russian immigrants fled here after the 1917 revolution. That mass exodus is called the first wave of immigration. The second one followed after the war. The third and fourth waves took place under the USSR. And the fifth one is going on today. That first wave of immigration is usually called white immigration. Actually, it's not quite a precise term, as not all of those who left then were whites. I mean, they didn't fight against the Reds during the Civil War in Russia. There were a lot of revolutionaries, SRs, for example, who were declared enemies by the Bolsheviks. There were also many civilians who did not participate in that war and did not want to live under Soviet rule, and those who were exiled by the Soviet government. But in the USSR, all those Russians who fled the country were called white émigrés. The name stuck, so we're going to use it in our film, just to distinguish this immigrant wave from all the following ones. Why have we decided to make an episode about these people? Let's put aside the obvious and numerous parallels with today's situation. They are so evident that we wouldn't like to highlight them even more. You will see them yourselves. When we talk about white immigrants, it always seems like those were stupendous people, almost titans who did not just live their lives. They suffered epically and triumphed over difficulties like heroes. They were true noblemen who were making history. It was true in a sense, because their stories were quite epic indeed. Anyway, just like any great picture, this is a mosaic first and foremost. If you've been watching our videos for quite a while, you know that what we care about most is not the whole picture itself, but its separate parts, individual people. If we take a closer look into the wave of white immigration, we'll start to see a lot of familiar things which we're facing today. It feels like this 100-year gap vanishes right away when viewed up close. It seems like we're talking about our acquaintances or neighbors. We thought this story would be rather relevant and interesting today. Sometimes it seems like a tragedy, sometimes it is a detective novel, or even a comedy, or an adventure story, in many cases. For instance, have you ever heard about the famous singer Nadezhda Plevitskaya and her husband, a white army general, who became Soviet intelligence agents and were involved in kidnapping or maybe even murder? Or about Ivan Bunin's love drama. It's a well-known fact that he became a Nobel Prize winner in exile. What is less known is that his muse, a girl who lived with the writer and his wife, left him for another woman. And what about the incredible story of Vasily Shulgin, a deputy of the Duma who accepted the abdication of Nicholas II and emigrated, but later returned illegally to the Soviet Union and wrote a fascinating book about it, which, just like his entire trip actually, had been organized and staged by state security agencies, as it turned out later, and he did not even suspect anything. Or maybe you heard about the Don Cossack Nikolai Paramonov, who had been a millionaire before the revolution, lost everything, and started from scratch in exile, and became a millionaire again. And what about Alexander Zubkov, who pretended to be a nobleman and a movie star, married Kaiser Wilhelm's sister, and blew everything that remained of her fortune? Actually, that may be untrue. These are just a few of the stories which happened to the white émigrés. We realize that we can't cram them all into one episode. Otherwise, this would be a never-ending episode. As we went deeper into the filming process, we decided to make 2 episodes. Later, we realized that the project couldn't be confined to 2 parts. So, we decided to make a mini-series of 3 episodes for the first time in our channel's history. Of course, all of you remember that the center of this immigration wave was Paris. We will definitely get there, but a whole lot of stories happened to white émigrés here in Berlin, Munich, Prague, Belgrade, Sremski, Karlovci, Gallipoli, and Constantinople. Of course, we were filming this in Russia as well, which many of the émigrés miss so much, and to which they desperately wanted to return. You'll see that it is a very modern story. Sure, its characters lived in another technological era. There was no internet back then. But we thought that many of their notes, and the émigrés left quite plenty of them, would fit right here on Telegram channels and chats. This is the only element where we took liberties in our mini-series. As for the stories and events, all of them are the unvarnished truth.
What's so unique about this first wave? Mass immigration in a short time period, mostly from 1918 to 1920. The number of fleeing noblemen was significant, but it's a misapprehension that this emigration was predominantly elite.
You mean that only the nobility fled, right?
That wasn't true. The nobility was a minority, but the number of elites among emigrants was very high.
Didn't the Bolsheviks prevent emigrants from fleeing? Or were they unhappy about this from the start?
How could they prevent this? People were fleeing from the territories which weren't under Bolshevik control yet.
By late 1920, the only territory in the European part of the former empire, which was not still controlled by the Bolsheviks, was Crimea. A huge number of future emigrants fled from there by sea. They were the last faction of the White Army under the command of Baron Pyotr Wrangel. The Reds under Frunze's command started their assault on Perikop and Sivas in November and cut their way through to the peninsula. They outnumbered the Whites more than 140,000 bayonets against the around 40,000 that the Whites had. Wrangel knew they weren't going to make it. There was no other option to save the remnants of the army except evacuation. This is the port of Moda in the Asian part of Istanbul. Today, it's a cool, trendy place with a highly developed park. There are many Russians here. You can hear Russian spoken everywhere. There are many tourists as well as new immigrants here. Just like 100 years ago, when you could hear Russian on every corner, because a flotilla of Russian ships evacuated here from Crimea. It was fall, November 1920. The Red Army invaded Crimea. The White Army's commander-in-chief, Pyotr Wrangel, gave an order to leave the peninsula. In his order, he wrote that those who didn't find themselves in immediate danger should think well about staying, because no one knew what lay ahead for them. Those who chose to evacuate with the army would have to share its road to Calvary, as Wrangel said. That's exactly what happened. The sadly remembered evacuation from Crimea started around November 10. I think you've heard about it. The Russian language still has an expression derived from this event to describe a chaotic hustle. Is the last ship from Sevastopol leaving now? The jostle was horrendous. Hundreds of thousands of people were trying to board the ships. This story is preserved in tens of memoirs and hundreds of photos. Movies were filmed about it in Soviet times. For example, do you remember Two Comrades Were Serving? A nice Soviet film. Around 150,000 people boarded 126 ships, from large steamboats and cruisers to tiny tugs, and departed Crimea for exile. So, after 5 days in the open sea, the Russian flotilla arrived here, in Constantinople, from Crimea. The number of ships had diminished by then. One of them sank during a storm. There's a cruel irony here. The name of that torpedo boat was Alive. Constantinople was not ruled by the Turks at that time, by the way. The Republic of Turkey, which we know today, did not yet even exist. After World War I, Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire back then, was obliged to sign a humiliating peace treaty because it had entered the war on the side of Germany and lost. Essentially, the empire collapsed. According to the peace treaty, the Allies got control over the Bosporus Strait, where Constantinople is located. Russia had a spectacular opportunity to gain control over the Bosporus then. This was one of the reasons why Russia had entered this war. As you might know, that was the centuries-old dream of many Russian rulers, to control both straits. But, you remember, Russia was torn by revolutions and the Civil War. No one cared about the straits. The Allies held a leading position here. The French took the newly arrived Russians under their wing. As the White Army's allies, they stood ready to welcome Russian emigrants here. But they weren't expecting to see that many people. They thought there were going to be 30 or maybe 50,000 newcomers. But 150,000 people came here at once.
None of the white anti-Bolshevist governments were recognized by the great powers. Not one. None of them except Wrangel's, who controlled Crimea and the Taurida province.
So, for France, he represented the legitimate government back then, right?
Yes, and Constantinople had enough space to accommodate both the military and civilians, albeit it was in horrible conditions.
The conditions on those ships were truly grave. You can easily imagine that. The ships were crammed with people. Holds, decks, staircases. Swarms of people were everywhere they could squeeze in. One contemporary wrote, they were hanging down from masts like clusters of grapes. They were not allowed to go ashore right away in Constantinople because the city was struck by a typhus epidemic. The French immediately announced a 2-week quarantine. People were in total distress because many of them had already run out of money and food. Small buy-sell exchange businesses started to appear around the arrived ships in the port. Those who took their family jewelry and gold were luckier because Russian money was not valid there. This was pretty clear. People spent days and days like this on the ships. Eventually, the French allowed civilians to come ashore, as they had completely different plans for the military.
They needed to convince Wrangel to disband the army, but he wanted to keep it. Europe was tired of wars. Nobody wanted to start a new war with the Bolsheviks, Therefore, no one needed Wrangel's army as a military entity.
That's why they wanted to disarm it.
Right, and to make the military men civilians.
One can understand what the French felt. Just imagine, you've taken control over the enemy city, and suddenly a whole armada of 70,000 armed servicemen appeared. A whole army. The first and most obvious wish of any authority is to at least disarm these people. That's not the worst part. You also need to supply and feed them. The French eventually took this responsibility with considerable reluctance. They decided to take everything that seemed valuable from the newly arrived ships as compensation. Provisions, ammunition, certain equipment. Some ships were confiscated entirely. As the Russian emigrants calculated later that the French expropriated 69 million francs worth of their property, which is equivalent to $60 million nowadays. Quite a sum. Of course, the white military did not want to disarm. Who would love to do that in such a situation? They were making a dramatic scene, throwing their rifles overboard so they wouldn't fall into French hands. The main reason why the Russians wanted to keep going as an army, and why this was so important to Wrangel himself, was that they thought they wouldn't stay there for long. We will face this many times in our narration. All of them thought that the Bolsheviks would soon fall and the whites would be able to come back to Russia. Those who came here thought a bit differently. They wanted to regroup. They thought the Allies would help, and they would return to Russia across the Black Sea, squeeze the Bolsheviks out of Crimea, and ultimate victory would be very close. Unlike the rest of his army, Commander Pyotr Nikolaevich Wrangel and his family lived in absolutely luxurious conditions on a yacht, or a small boat. It was moored here, on the Bosphorus, and had the name Lucal. This yacht had an amusing history. It was built in England and later bought by Russia. For some time, it was an administrative boat for the Russian ambassador to Constantinople. Later, it was dispatched to Crimea, became the White Army's property, and returned here in 1920 with the rest of the Russian Armada. Wrangel lived on this yacht and even hosted official and unofficial receptions there because the official residence and headquarters of the Russian emigrants was the Russian embassy. But it was too cramped to fit everybody. Anyway, it was more pleasant to be on a yacht, even though Wrangel used to complain about cockroaches and confined spaces. But we all know how hard it is to live on a yacht. Just kidding. On October 15, 1921, about a year after the Russians had arrived here, the Italian steamship Adria, coming from the Black Sea, from Batumi, crashed into this yacht and broke it in half. The yacht sank immediately. The impact occurred in that very part where the general's bedroom was located. By a happy coincidence, Wrangel and his family were not on board at that moment. They were ashore. A few people died. Wrangel's extensive archives sank with the yacht, as well as a considerable part of his fortune, as they say.
Luckily, it happened to be the anniversary, the wedding anniversary of my grandfather and my grandmother. So they slipped off the boat to Constantinople for an evening dinner. And just after they left, the freighter rammed the yacht and it sank in about 3 minutes. And actually, I have here in my office one of the few things that rose to the surface. NKVD hired an Italian freighter that rammed the boat and sunk it.
An official investigation revealed that it was an accident. Of course, the steamship's captain was guilty, but he had no ill intentions. Inevitably, a rumor that this was an assassination attempt on Wrangel immediately spread among the Russian emigrants. There was no proof for a long time. However, a couple of years later, in 1923, Maxim Gorky, he was in Europe by that time, told his friend Vladislav Hodasevich that Yelena Ferrari had had a finger in that pie. Such personalities appear in the most critical historical times. In other circumstances, you could call them Renaissance, as they usually have plenty of talents. This was an outstanding woman in every sense of the word. She was beautiful, she was a polyglot, and spoke 5 or 6 languages, including Turkish. She was a poet, she wrote poems, had many acquaintances in the literary circles, and was on a first-name term with Gorky. Most importantly, she was a Soviet intelligence agent. As it was later confirmed by documents, she came to Constantinople and later to Europe on the State Political Directorate's assignment. Ferrari's fate was predictably tragic and very typical for that period. She came back from Europe and continued her state security service. In 1938, Ferrari was arrested and was shot. So, Gorky told Hadasevich that Yelena Ferrari was on board of that steamship, Adria, that smashed into Wrangel's yacht. If that was actually true, there is other evidence that she was on a mission in Constantinople in 1921. Then, this accident with the yacht is not an unhappy coincidence. It was probably an assassination attempt on Wrangel, but he survived.
Well, look, I mean, there were lots of spies running around. I mean, you know, the Bolsheviks are very good and sort of underground stuff. They'd been underground for God knows how many years. They were a lot better at it. Absolutely, there were spies. There.
We focused mostly on Wrangel's emigration in this episode, but it is only fair to say that the remnants of General Denikin's army had come here after their evacuation from Novorossiysk a few months before Wrangel's troops. Most of them had evacuated to Crimea, but around 25,000 people had come here right away. The relationship between these two generals is a story of two bears in one den. They were both military leaders, two chiefs, men of ideas and great ideals that could not stand the sight of each other. At some point, Wrangel served under Denikin and was constantly criticizing him. Later, Wrangel was invested with the command of the army by Denikin, when it could no longer have any pivotal impact on the outcome of the Civil War. You can't say that they were two epicenters of emigration when they were both in exile. They did not interact in any manner.
But that was one of the big mistakes of the White Army, was that it became a question of personalities. And of course, that was a problem between Denikin and my grandfather. Denikin always thought my grandfather was a glory hound, that he was a guy who was looking for glory. You know, he was this dashing commander, and he was everything that Denikin wasn't.
Denikin described his time in Constantinople in his book Russian Turmoil, Memoirs. A very tragic episode which had a great impact on the general happened here. His closest associate, General Ivan Romanovsky, was shot right in the Russian embassy. Denikin was so depressed that he went to Europe right after Ivan Romanovsky's funeral and never ever came back to Constantinople and Turkey in general. Most émigrés considered Constantinople a transfer point and did not stay here long. For instance, Ivan Bunin was here just for a couple of weeks.
By the beginning of the revolution, Bunin was already a 2-time Pushkin Prize laureate and an honorary member of the Imperial Academy of Sciences, specializing in fine literature. Bunin had never thought of emigration, never ever. All that horror was developing in front of his eyes. He'd been feeling these growing revolutionary sentiments since 1905. It was the first shot across the bow. He felt that. In 1907, he said, 10 more years and Russia will be over. The revolution happened. He left the country only a year after that, in early summer 1918. He went to the south, to Odessa. Even this was not an easy thing to do. He left the country at the very last moment, on the very last ship from Odessa. He held off until the last minute, thinking, just wait a bit, it's almost over. The Allies will soon come here. The French, the Americans, someone else. When the Red Army troops were approaching Odessa and were about to invade the city, Bunin was getting on board of the steamship Sparta, the last one that happened to take to the sea.
The French steamship Sparta headed to Constantinople. Since Bunin was a prominent figure, they gave him and his wife, Vera Moromtseva, a separate cabin. Considering the situation, that was top luxury. However, they were not alone in that cabin. They shared it with Nikodim Kondakov and his secretary, Yekaterina Yatsenko. Nikodim Kondakov was a very distinguished historian specializing in Byzantine history. Yekaterina was his student, secretary, mistress, and sometimes nurse. Kondakov was 75 years old at that moment. They reached Constantinople at dusk after almost a week at sea. The French authorities sent them to a stone, ice-cold shed for an ice-cold shower right away to get disinfected. It was necessary because a typhoid epidemic was raging in the city.
Bunin exclaimed, "Kondakov and I are academics. We are immortal. No infection can take us down." The doctor gave up and let them go.
Bunin and his wife spent their first night in exile like thousands of other émigrés, in some unheated shed with the whistling wind. Both Bunin and Kondakov didn't like Constantinople at all. They instantly started to bustle about getting visas. They both got them from Bulgaria. Soon, they managed to buy tickets, which was also a great problem, and they took the train to Sofia. By the way, they had taken the route which Agatha Christie immortalized in her famous crime story, Murder on the Orient Express, 12 years after the events we are describing now. Bunin and Kondakov followed the route of the Orient Express from Constantinople to Sofia. Well, that route went further to Paris and left the city. Other emigrants, like Vladimir Nabokov's family, didn't even go ashore in Turkey. 20-year-old Vladimir Nabokov came to Constantinople on the Greek steamship with an appropriate name, Hope. They left Crimea with great troubles. When Hope was putting out to sea, an artillery attack had already started. As it turned out later, there was almost no food on board. While the ship was in the open sea, people had to rely on the provisions they had managed to take. As you might understand, those were quite scarce. Nabokov saw the sun rising over the Bosporus and wrote his poem called Istanbul. By the way, don't forget that the city still had the name of Constantinople at that time.
Istanbul rises out of the dusk, two sharp black minarets, in the dark gold of dawn, above the bright silk of the water.
Unlike many other Russian emigrants, Nabokov didn't stay in Constantinople at all. Just a couple of days later, Hope left the port and headed to Greece, to the port of Piraeus in Athens. Soldiers and officers from Wrangel's army were allowed to come ashore after 2 weeks of tedious waiting on the ships. The main body, the 1st Army Corps under Kutupov's command, was not allowed in Constantinople at all. They disembarked 200 kilometers southwest of the city on the shores of the Dardanelles Strait. We are in the small Turkish town of Gallipolian, right on the shore of the Dardanelles. The views here are just beautiful. Of course, the émigrés didn't think about local beauty then. It takes about a day to get here from Istanbul by sea. This is exactly where the rest of General Kutupov's 1st Army Corps came ashore. This corps is considered one of the most combat capable of the Russian army. Well, it was considered. By the time they got to Gallipolian, the soldiers were exhausted, disarmed, and tortured by distressful uncertainty ahead of them. It's important to explain what the town of Gallipolian and this whole area looked like in 1920. As we remember, World War I had recently ended. One of the key operations had unfolded here. In Russia, it's hardly even known. It was called the Dardanelles Campaign. The Allies, England and France, fought against Turkey. It was a large-scale landing operation. The French and the British wanted to make their way to Constantinople and deprive the Turks of control over the Bosporus. Do you know who was the author and key driver of this operation? First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill. It was a total failure. The landing party failed because the Turks were desperately resisting. Casualties were huge on both sides. The French and the British and the Anzacs evacuated after almost a year of fighting. As a result, the whole town of Gallipoli was in ruins. When the Russian army came here, they saw quite a depressing picture. Several years after that, the Russians of Gallipoli published a book of their memories of their life in this town. Here's a quote from it. The town seemed dead. The Greek flag waving over one of the buildings indicated that there still was life here, but it was impossible to discern its manifestations no matter how hard we tried. The view was depressing. It felt like a leviathan had stepped on this small town, smashed it, crashed it, scattered it, and went on having sown death and destruction. This is the place where the events known as sitting around in Gallipoli took place. This word combination is almost forgotten now. However, it conveys what the Russian army was doing here very accurately.
When Russians came here, it was pretty crowded here at first. About 26,000 servicemen were housed in the camp. Besides, there were also people who weren't part of the army, 1,500 women and over 3,000 kids. Local Turkish population was about 2,500 people. So, it was simply impossible to accommodate all the Russians in the city. A third of them settled in Gelibolu. The other two-thirds stayed in the camp, about 8 kilometers away from here. The Russians were about to face a great disappointment.
The Russians set up a huge military camp on this field about 7 kilometers away from Gallipoli. Let's see what they were saying. General Kutepov rode a horse to the place the French told them about and literally found a bare field covered with wet mud. In the distance, you could see a mount covered with low-growing shrubs. Here it is. A strap of the dirty Hellespont could be seen on the side. They meant the Dardanelles Strait. It's over there. A northeaster was blowing and bending wiry grass to the ground. The view was so dull and deserted that Kutepov involuntarily uttered an exclamation, "Is that all?" When he came back to the steamship, he didn't even share his impressions. As you can see, it's winter now too. The weather is very nice. The sun is shining. We talked to the locals. They said, "We just got lucky with the weather. Usually, a very strong wind from the sea blows here 200 days a year. And don't forget that the climate has gotten much milder over the past 100 years. Why did they choose this place? Because an English military camp had been located here before the Russians came. The British gave this place a sentimental name, the Valley of Roses and Death. Why roses? Because wild dog roses grew here. Why death? Because it's the habitat of wild snakes. The Russians gave this place a rather unpoetic and quite accurate name, Barefield, which sounds very similar to the word Gallipoli in Russian. They set up tents on the bare field. The remnants of Kutepov's First Corps lived there for 1.5 years. It was something like a military and refugee camp.
The Russian camp was located on both banks of the river. There were tents all around here, up to the village of Fendik, in that direction, and up to the seashore over there. It's necessary to say that the Russians managed to build a whole big settlement. Of course, those were simple, even primitive constructions of clay and stone. Servicemen's families were allowed to live in the camp. Living conditions were harsh. The Russians had to not just share houses. Several people could live in one room. They had to divide the space with bed sheets that hung down like curtains. The Russians had no work here. They simply tried to survive, find food and a place to live. The situation in Istanbul was different. Refugees could work as drivers or secretaries. A whole new culture of white émigrés emerged there.
Russian émigrés were forced to make a living by doing odd jobs here. They all suffered from a lack of money. Not many of them had enough money to rent a decent apartment. They huddled wherever they could. Some of them spent the night in mosques. Others stayed in churches. Some émigrés received help from the Russian embassy. It was situated here on Grand Rue des Pères. Today, it's Istiklal Avenue, one of the central streets in Istanbul. An epicenter of Russian life started to evolve here. Russian restaurants, Russian saloons. We talked about this in detail in our episode about Turkey. Here's the link, check it out. It's worth noting the number of Russians that inundated the city. The population of Constantinople was about 900,000 people at that point, and at least 150,000 Russians came here in 1920. Not all of them disembarked from the ships, but at least 100,000 émigrés did. They'd been coming before that too. So, you can imagine how many Russians happened to be here at the same time. In just a couple of years, only 30,000 Russian émigrés remained. In 1928, when Ataturk had already come to power, the Turks implemented a very strict policy. You either speak Turkish or go away. This is the main reason why there are few descendants of those very first Russian émigrés living in modern Turkey now, compared to Paris or Berlin.
The Russians brought changes to the traditional way of life in the city. For instance, they opened restaurants in this area where they sang old Russian romantic ballads. They were making a living by doing odd jobs. Some of them worked as doorkeepers. Others would cut wood and bring it to the town. They would pick up pieces of wood on the shore after severe storms and sell them.
The key problem in the Russian camp was that there was almost no paid jobs in Gallipoli for the émigrés to earn money and to be able to buy something. Obviously, the Russians would never mind even the dirty and hard work. They were gradually selling all their possessions they had brought with them. Of course, the state property in the camp started disappearing too. But in general, supplying of the Russian camp was in the hands of the French. They established daily rationing, which the Russian emigrants scrupulously recorded and reproduced in this Gallipoli memoir book a few years later. I've already cited some extracts from it for you. Well, ordinary bread or biscuits, 500 grams a day. We've gathered all these products together here. This is what 500 grams look like. Flour, cereals, homogeneous products, 150 grams. We chose lentils for the sake of clarity. Frozen or canned meat, 250 grams. We took canned meat. Salt, where is it? Here. Fats, we bought butter as an example. Sugar, tea. By the standards of the 20th century, when a terrible famine would happen every now and then, this grocery box doesn't look terrible. It looks like the French tried to provide them with the best they could. Merci, monsieur. But if we look at it from a modern point of view, we realize right away that this daily ration was not sufficient for adult men, which made up the majority of the Russian camp. This is why malnourishment was a topical issue there. This topic permeates through all the memoirs about staying in Gallipoli. a unique visual document about everyday life in the Gallipoli camp has been preserved to this day. This is a collection of cartoons by Mikhail Chernyavsky, worked under the pseudonym Zero. This collection was republished later in Europe and has appeared in different auctions several times. By the way, you can find it even today at an online auction on the internet if you're interested. When you look at it, you can understand what the emigrants in Gallipoli thought, what they cared about and laughed at. Here's the picture of them competing for bread crusts. One of them turns around and says, "It is for this, it is for that." Everybody hopes that it is for them. They are all hungry like wolves, but they lack bread. Look, they are cooking turtle soup. And here's another cartoon called Turtle Campaign, the disturbed tranquility of the virgin prairie. It's clear that there were turtles in the valley. At least it's meat. The camp residents arranged a real hunt for them. Hunting for wild animals under the life-giving rays of the spring sun. You can instantly understand that is about the fight against lice and other insects. The Gallipoli Russians didn't have soap during their first months here. The French gave it to them later. That is why the problem of lice and other vermin was so acute. Here's a nice cartoon called Gastronomer. A man is eating a snake. Another man asks him, "What are you doing, Sidorov? It's poisonous." The first man answers, "That's okay, Colonel. It's boiled anyways." You can imagine what kind of jobs the Russians in Gallipoli would take up. They were willing to take on any type of job, basically. Companions in misfortune. A mule and a Russian in Gallipoli. As the following cartoon suggests, there were clearly social inequalities in the camp. Officers had a much better life than ordinary soldiers. This cartoon is called An Outing for Cigarette Butts. The soldiers are waiting for an officer to finish his cigarette and throw the butt away. It needs no comments. It's clear that this did not contribute to good discipline. Here they are playing football, the transformation of potential energy into kinetic energy. Actually, it's a real fact. There was a football team in the Russian camp. Did the Russians play against each other?
Even amid hardships and deprivation, they managed to sew sports uniforms and shoes for playing football, as well as the balls. 23 football teams appeared here inside the military corps. The Russians held large football tournaments. Even the Turks attended the matches with great pleasure. Only Russians played, yes. However, one of the teams that consisted of Russian émigrés was called Gallipoli Spor. It was a very famous football club. In away games abroad, they used to defeat Czech and Bulgarian teams by a huge margin.
There was an English ship there too. The British had a gymnastics team. They looked lean, dry and tough. They were all young, even though they were all veterans. So they challenged the Whites and held a football match against them. What was the result? The White Guards were winning 3-1. 20 minutes before the end of the match, the British gave up and left the field.
And they created a life for themselves, believe it or not. They were there for about 2 years. They had chess clubs. It was really quite a testament to their fortitude. And it's interesting, at that moment in time, many of them believed that they were going to go back and fight again. So they managed to maintain this sort of military discipline.
This is what we see in the photograph. Here's the place where the officers would go on guard. They continue to conduct exercises, live by military rules, and adhere to routine. Kutepov strictly enforced discipline.
Let's say a couple of words about Alexander Kutepov himself. He was one of the brightest leaders of the White Movement and the whole civil war in Russia. He was a shrewd military man. His military career started during the Russo-Japanese War. By World War I, he was already a colonel. He was one of the few officers that tried to resist the revolution in Petrograd in February 1917. Of course, there were few people who supported Kutepov. Nobody wanted to risk their lives for the monarchy. He returned to the front during World War I. He was wounded several times and received several military awards. Later, he joined the White Movement and participated in the famous Ice March with Denikin. Maybe I'll film an episode about it one day. As a result, when the Russian army came under Wrangel's command, Kutepov remained the commander of the First Army Corps. The memoirs of Captain Nikolai Raevsky have survived to this day. He wrote, "Kutepov behaved here like no other general did before the revolution. For example, yesterday he personally beat the officers who tried to go over to Kemal Pasha and tore off their shoulder straps. By going over to Kemal Pasha, he meant enrolling in the army of Kemal. Future Ataturk was recruiting. Later, he liberated the country with its help and established the modern Republic of Turkey. Kutepov, like Wrangel, was doing his best to keep his army functional. He was planning to fight again for Russia. That was why he resisted any attempts by his soldiers to enlist somewhere else. He literally resisted with his fists. The French who were in power here were trying to divide the army as hard as they could and make the Russians join them. They offered the Emigrés to go fight in South America. There were plenty of conflicts there at that period. Some did go. Chernyavsky made a cartoon dedicated to it. It says Brazilians. This is what they used to call those who were about to go to South America. A French officer is recruiting them here. Many Russians were recruited into the French Foreign Legion. The French would post numerous leaflets with appeals to join up. The Russians would tear them down. The French had to put sentries to guard those leaflets. Chernyavsky left us a cartoon about it. Here you can see Russian soldiers distracting the sentry. They replaced the leaflet with another one which says that the Russian army will go only where Wrangel ordered it to. They're making fun of the French sentry who continues to guard the leaflet and doesn't understand anything. The leaflet is quite racist, I have to say.
Relations between the Russians and the French had always been strained. They were constantly in conflict. The French did not want to compromise and meet the requirements of the White Army. It seems to me that the French were afraid of the Russian army because it was very strong.
Here is Wrangel himself. Why wasn't he allowed to live with his army?
I think Wrangel was the person who controlled the situation in Istanbul and maintained international ties.
My grandfather always thought that Kutepov had held him in very high regard. And to his credit, as I said before, Kutepov really saved thousands of people when they were stuck on Gallipoli.
Wrangel would come to Gallipoli from time to time. His wife also came here for a visit.
I love such juxtaposition so much. This is Baroness Wrangel's school. Here are the Russian kids who studied here. This is 1920. This is 2023. The same building, the same steps. About 200-300 kids arrived at the Russian camp with the Russian military. This school was arranged for them. Baroness Wrangel took it under her wing. It is called the Wrangel School. This house is still called this among the locals.
The Russians continued to lead their normal life as if they were still in Russia. They retained educational and military institutions. I think this is important. White Russians believed that Russia simply migrated here with them.
Did they publish newspapers here?
The so-called spoken newspaper was issued in Gallipoli. The news here was read over the loudspeaker every day. The Russians had done a lot for the city in general.
There were plenty of talented poets here. I've got a Gallipoli lullaby in my archive. Let me read it for you. Rock-a-bye, my sweet Russian warrior, rock-a-bye. A French Arab is keeping an eye on your cradle. May you dream of lira, shah, sugar, bread, figs. At least in your dreams, you'll be happy in peace. You'll arrange a feast. Let Russia not be in your dream. Life is not easy there. Trotsky and the dungeons of the Cheka are waiting for you there. Sleep by the mountains of Gallipoli, as if it's your native land. Sleep, dear warrior of Taurida fields. Rock-a-bye. Volunteer Alexander Mikhailov.
They arranged a theatre and a library in the camp.
Is that a theater?
Right, it's a city theatre. It could accommodate 1,000 spectators, but the Russians managed to set up a theatre that could accommodate 2,500 people. During their entire stay in Gallipoli, the Russians staged more than 80 performances based on the works of Chekhov, Ostrovsky, and Gogol. They staged theatrical shows based on famous writers' works. By the way, the locals also enjoy going to the performances and participating in them.
Nadezhda Plevitskaya also performed at the Russian Gallipoli Theater. She was a very famous Russian folk singer before the revolution. Rumor has it, the royal family was deeply touched by her voice.
Nicholas II called her the Nightingale of Kursk. Plevitskaya used to sing, presenting every single song as a performance, a spectacle. She cared about the message of every composition.
She was a woman of the people, a peasant. That was a unique phenomenon in Tsarist Russian culture. She rose from a peasant to a superstar.
Plevitskaya was born in the village of Vinikova in Kursk province. Her maiden name was Nadezhda Vinikova.
She joined a dance troupe, one of the participants of which was Edmund Plevitsky. Edmund Plevitsky was a spectacular dancer at that time. He used to perform at the Warsaw Opera and Ballet Theatre. Plevitsky managed her talent and influenced her in many ways. He was much older than her. They seemed to be good friends. That's why she asked permission from her mother.
For marriage?
Right. They got married but divorced soon after. As Plevitskaya was rising higher and higher in her musical career, she started receiving large fees and attracting larger audiences. Merchants would get sober when she used to sing a song called "The Horse is Dragging Slowly."
There is great irony and occasional Russian symbolism in the fact that the most important building associated with Nadezhda Plevitskaya, an important person for the Russian immigration, is also associated with a very prominent layer of pre-revolutionary Moscow history. Now it is called the Soviet Hotel, and the red flag flutters above it. This hotel is really called Soviet. It has its own rich history. There are also many myths about it. We could even film a whole episode about this hotel. This place was absolutely legendary before the revolution. The restaurant Yar was opened in Moscow in the early 19th century. Believe it or not, Pushkin himself wrote about it. How long will I remember? Unwillingly fasting, veal cold, and Yar's truffles. That Yar was located downtown at Kuznetsky Bridge. In 1830, the restaurant moved here to the Moscow suburbs. Its further history is associated with Alexei Sudakov, a merchant from Yaroslavl, a self-made man, like all merchants. He bought this restaurant. He was one of those people who created a concept of what leisure for Moscow merchants, masters of life, should look like. They had to ride every evening in a sleigh with bells. Gypsies were also mandatory. By the way, the Roma theater Roman is now located here, a kind of greeting from the past. So they had to come with gypsies to escape from the hustle and bustle, rush through the whole city with ringing and songs. You probably watched the film Cruel Romance. It's well shown there. They would come to the Moscow suburbs to yar. The expression to come to yar has been used in the Russian language since then. The merchants used to revel here. They would go on a tear until morning. They reveled recklessly. The tables were laden with food and the best wine. You could smear mustard on the face of the waiter if he did something wrong for an extra 100 rubles. If you paid 120 rubles, you could throw a bottle of champagne and break a Venetian mirror. Mr. Sudakov took care of everything in advance. And live music was an important part of the program. Today, live music is considered boorish in good restaurants. At that time, on the contrary, it was considered great. Future big stars started their careers right here. Nadezhda Plevitskaya was one of them. She came for a job interview with Sudakov himself. He hired her. This was a quick success. When merchants heard Plevitskaya singing Russian romantic ballads and Russian folk songs, which were her main repertoire, they would always start crying, especially when they were a bit tipsy. A few years later, Plevitskaya was already a big star in the city. All merchants knew her. Her name was in everybody's mouth. She already had concerts, invitations, and huge fees. She left Sudakov a year later and broke her long-term contract. He sued her for 500 rubles, but she could already afford it. Yesterday's peasant woman paid him and pursued a solo career. From that moment on, she became the most famous performer in Russia for some time. She was the most famous performer of Russian folk songs. She was probably like Alla Pugacheva in the late Soviet period. I don't even know who I can compare her with. Today, everything is broken into small universes. We do not have one big star today like Plevitskaya was in that period. Believe it or not, but people even used to compare her with Chelyapin. This woman went into exile. This long, very bright, and very dramatic story with a tragic ending, which happened later in exile, began here, in Yar. There was no red flag then.
After she had divorced with Plevitsky, she became engaged to Vladimir Shangin, as she wrote in her memoirs. He was a brilliant officer. She went to the front with him. World War I evoked a huge patriotic upsurge. She became a sister of mercy. He was a great officer.
He was a very brave man, and a general too. Marrying a Russian officer was a great privilege back then.
He was killed in 1915.
It was very tough for Plevitskaya to deal with the loss because her mother passed away the same year.
Her first husband was Plevitsky.
Right.
She kept his surname, and her third husband is... Her second husband.
She wasn't married to Shangin.
Right, he's Levitsky.
Levitsky.
There were jokes about that.
Yes, it became the subject of jokes, that she removes one letter from each husband's surname. If it would start with the letter E, it would sound provocative. So, Nadezhda Vasilyevna honeymoon November 1917. Her husband is Yuri Levitsky, a white officer. Plevitskaya found herself in a new reality. As you might know from history, all white officers were offered the chance to rip their epaulets off.
And join the Red Army.
Yes, the Red Army. Yuri Levitsky made this choice. In fall 1918, when the whites were already approaching Kursk, Levitsky managed to get himself invited on an intelligence meeting and took Nadezhda Plevitskaya with him.
His wife.
Right. Neither he nor she returned from this intelligence mission, which alarmed the authorities. They crossed the front line and that's it. She didn't speak about him anywhere and started a completely different life. She moved to the south. Plevitskaya met Skoblin. We don't know exactly how they met, but we know for sure that they got married in October 1921 in the camp church in Gallipoli.
When Plevitskaya came here, she got married to General Nikolai Skoblin. They had their wedding right here. Kutepov stood in for her father for the wedding. They say Kutepov was so delighted and touched by Plevitskaya's singing that he gave Skoblin and her a separate tent. It was an incredible luxury for those days.
Skoblin decided to work with Nadezhda Vasilyevna as her promoter and tour organizer. Wrangel wasn't happy with this decision. Skoblin fell out of favor.
Remember the names of Plevitskaya and Skoblin. Later, they played a very important and even fatal role in the fate of General Kutepov and the Russian émigrés in general.
According to the recollections of local residents, Turkish women often sang Russian songs along with the Russian women. Turkish children also chanted in Russian with their Russian peers.
We modern Russians, who visit Turkey mainly in the summer, may have this logical question. Well, okay, the sea is not that pleasant in winter, it's dank and windy here. But the émigrés spent at least one summer here in Gallipoli. Yes, this is another tradition that the Russians brought here, bathing on the beach. For some reason, locals were not big fans of that at all. At first, they were even surprised when the Russian officers would go swimming in the sea, but then they got used to it. Actually, the Russian refugees had another reason to get in the sea in addition to recreation. We told you about when we were looking through Chernyavsky's cartoons. The reason is lice. They had to deal with it somehow. Salty sea was a perfect solution.
When the Russians first arrived in Gallipoli, a cemetery was not their first necessity. However, there were both wounded and sick people among the refugees. After some time, the Whites realized that they needed a burial site. The Turks gave them part of their cemetery.
About 300 people died in the Russian camp during their time in Gallipoli. A small Russian cemetery appeared here, but it has not survived to this day. In 1921, this modest monument was built according to the second lieutenant of the Technical Regiment, Akatiev's design. Akatiev came up with the idea of ancient mounds. Each warrior would bring a stone which made up this cone-shaped monument. Ruthless Chernyavsky also had a cartoon about the construction of this monument. Here it is, as you can see. In addition to the warriors who lost their lives in Gallipoli, he also mentions those who found eternal peace in 1854 to 1855. Those were prisoners of the Crimean War, in memory of our ancestors, the Cossacks, who died in Turkish captivity. This inscription is no longer there. The monument was completely destroyed by an earthquake in the 1940s and was restored only in the 2000s. The Turkish authorities decided to remove this reference to Turkish captivity.
This was a police station back then. Here is the headquarters of the Russian Corps, right next to it. It hasn't been preserved to this day, but you can see it in the old photographs. A large group of military men who were subsequently sent to Serbia lined up here. They left Gallipoli for Serbia from this very place.
The Russians wanted to leave Gallipoli from the moment they got here. Of course, they hoped to return to Russia. Most of them indeed ended up in Orthodox countries, not in their fatherland, but in the Balkans. Locals started to host refugees in an organized manner. For those who were still here, for those who did not enlist or leave this place earlier, their stay in Gallipoli ended in May 1923, when the last detachment under General Martinov's command departed by ship. They headed to Serbia, where the locals were already waiting for them. In the early 1920s, Serbia, which was called the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, gave shelter to tens of thousands of Russian immigrants. Moreover, if we compare the way they were welcomed in Constantinople, the way they were treated by the French, and all the way they were received here in Serbia, it was far more cordial. Well, not with arms wide open, but still as friendly as you can imagine in that situation. Why?
Firstly, the Russian population, the Russian immigrants were ethnically close to the Serbs. They were Orthodox Slavs, but at the same time, they were people who had nowhere to go. Many of them were well educated. Most immigrants had graduated from secondary schools, gymnasiums, and non-classical secondary schools. It was important because these people were most in demand. They could teach in gymnasiums and schools, they could work as officials, and they could make up for the terrible demographic imbalance created by Serbia's participation in the Balkan Wars, and later in the First World War. A lot of soldiers and officers died. Moreover, those were not soldiers and officers of the regular army. Those were the professional class, people who were drafted into the army and died in the wars.
One of the reasons why Serbia welcomed the Russians so cordially was the King of Serbia, or rather the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Alexander Karageorgievich. He was generally known as a Russophile. He studied in St. Petersburg in the Corps of Pages. Rumor had it he was considered as the future husband for one of the daughters of Nicholas II. All of them would later be killed in Apatiev House, as we remember. So he had some personal motives to help Russian emigrants. What was the most important thing Serbia did for the Russian immigrants besides just showing hospitality? The Russians were provided with the necessary documents here. Many of them got Serbian passports and refugee certificates. And here's another important thing. They were officially registered as refugees. A refugee commission was set up. The UN High Commission for Refugees, which is a branch structure functioning in many places around the globe, has its roots in this situation. Serbia was the first country to set up a professional organization that was concerned with helping refugees, Russian refugees.
The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovens created a state commission and allowed the Russian embassy to operate within the framework of this mission. So the embassy had the right and the legal opportunity to confirm the legal status of refugees. Many people didn't have any documents, but even at that time it was impossible to cross borders without passports.
It is important to remember that the Russian immigrants had no passports. I mean, they did, but those had been issued by the country that no longer existed.
Many people passed through Belgrade. Documents were one of the reasons. For example, Bunin was not going to live in Belgrade, but he stayed there for a while until he got his passport. There were many people of different social classes and different educational levels. Who stayed there? What kind of people stayed? First of all were servicemen. The military was provided with jobs. Those who could work, disabled people and so on, were given pensions and benefits. Serbians helped the disabled and elderly.
Russians started to come to Serbia even before General Martinov's last emigrants left Gallipoli. There were more than 40,000 of them at the peak of emigration. You may ask, what are 40,000 compared to the 150,000 people that came to Constantinople at the same time? But let's put these numbers in context. The population of Belgrade at that time was just 110,000 people. There were a lot more than 40,000 Russians here, especially when the Gallipoli refugees came, up to 100,000 people. They used Belgrade as a hub for their further travels around Europe. As a matter of fact, they came here by ship primarily. Many of them went ashore in the port of Dubrovnik. That was the territory of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes back then. This is that very Dubrovnik, a resort on the Adriatic Sea, which has become very popular among Russians today. Of course, most emigrants headed to Belgrade, because there were numerous job opportunities there. This was the first and most important thing that refugees needed. There were plenty of jobs for immigrants in Serbia. I mean physical labor. The country was in ruins after World War I. Many roads needed to be restored and repaired. In addition, a new state had emerged, so new roads were to be built from scratch. Russian emigrants, especially yesterday's soldiers and officers, young and strong men, fit this need perfectly. The new state gladly recruited them for this. At least several thousand Russians constructed bridges, dug tunnels, repaired and built roads in the 1920s. Most of them were former military. Even though they were robust men, this was clearly not the kind of work they were used to, and not the kind of job any of us would wish for.
The officers would engage in physical work here. They would load sleepers and build railways.
They were officers, weren't they?
Right. You can tell by the epaulettes and lapel pins if you zoom in on the picture. One of them has an officer's badge. They were constructing a road in Korbevac. Russian officers would quarry stone high in the mountains, blow up high mountain ranges and build the road, which is still in use. It's still called the Russian way.
Russians were often paid less than locals, simply because they were willing to work for cheap. Serbs would refuse to give jobs to Russian emigrants under a plausible pretext. They would say that it's embarrassing to force such a respected person, a high-ranking officer, to work. This was repeated many other times in other centers of Russian emigration. This whole situation messed up what had been unshakable in pre-revolutionary Russia, namely social class differences. Representatives of the nobility were forced to look for work here, along with completely ordinary people. For example, according to the legends, former Volyn vice-governor Sergei Sheremetyev worked here as an ordinary clerk in an English insurance company. And he was lucky to find this job, because the former leader of the Moscow nobility, Prince Golitsyn, could not find a job and lived off his wife, who sewed bed linen. I mean, if you are lucky to have a lot of money, don't think you will have it forever.
The money ran out. It took a lot of money to keep an army. No matter how hard they tried to earn a living, it didn't make much sense. On top of that, the Petrograd loan treasury was at Wrangel's disposal. The Petrograd loan treasury was a pawn shop or a silver treasury. Back in the 18th century, Ivan Ivanovich Betsky established it in order to use the proceeds to help orphans and so on.
How did it end up in Wrangel's hands?
He captured it. Well, it was evacuated, like many other things, when the Germans threatened Petrograd. So, it was 8 rail cars of silver.
You mean 8 cars with jewelry?
Well, yes, silver.
What do you mean by at Wrangel's disposal? Did he take them to the Balkans later?
Yes, all 8 cars ended up in the south. Later, Wrangel's soldiers captured them and took them away on those ships to Constantinople and then to the Balkans.
What did he spend them on?
Well, on the maintenance of his army. It's actually an interesting story. It was a huge scandal. After all, these deposits and pledges were made by private individuals.
They could even claim their rights.
Exactly. Although it's clear that most of them stayed in Soviet Russia.
Right.
And the Wrangelites announced that they would wait for the claims during such and such a period, or otherwise they'd start selling everything. It was a huge scandal. Here's the thing. Try selling it. Who on earth would buy it? Imagine, some general has captured someone's property and is now going to sell it. Eventually, they managed to sell everything through a private company. Moreover, it was dangerous to sell items, because they could be identified, requested, and so on. It was sold as scrap silver. They did it with a 30% discount, but at the very least, they made £110,000 sterling. This was a huge sum for the Balkans. The dinar was a rather weak currency back then. This was another reason why they went to the Balkans. Life was cheap there. This was one of the most important factors for emigration. They reserved 10,000 in case any owners showed up to claim their money. £100,000 were spent on the maintenance of the army. Wrangel kept his army for about a year, trying to set up a government in exile. The Russian council operated there for about a year in Sremski, Karlovci.
We are in the small Serbian town of Sremski, Karlovci, about an hour's drive from Belgrade. This is a very important town for our history. It's the place where Baron General Pyotr Nikolaevich Wrangel settled in 1922. He lived in this house. A memorial plaque is still here. It's still an ordinary residential building. Officers of the Wrangel command staff resided all around the town and also spent 4 years here. A couple of words about this man. If you are old enough, you probably remember the song that was taught in schools in Soviet times. But from the taiga to the British seas, the Red Army is the strongest of all. The Black Baron was Wrangel. Why black? In the last years of service, he always wore one and the same uniform. It was a black Circassian coat with cartridge belts. Those are propellant powder charges that were inserted into special pockets on a Circassian coat. He really was black. He also wore a black papaka hat, a real black baron. But the fact that he was preparing to restore the royal throne was a lie. Moreover, it was offensive to Wrangel because he had never been a monarchist. Before joining the army, he was a famous socialite in the capital. He was handsome, 6 foot tall. He was a horse guardsman who won the hearts of a huge number of women. Well, he was a remarkable person in all respects. When he had already built his career in the White Army, he was in a tough confrontation with General Denikin, because Denikin was a very conservative, obstinate man. Wrangel, on the contrary, was doing his best to find a compromise. He realized that the re-establishment of the Tsarist regime in its former form was impossible. He understood that it was necessary to negotiate with different forces. He tried to reach an agreement with the Green Guerrillas, Makhnovists, and others. He wanted to get ordinary people, peasants, on his side. He realized how important it was in the context of the Civil War and Bolshevik propaganda.
Number one, he was very well educated. Okay, he was actually a civil engineer by training, by education, and he had a very, it was a European kind of family. His political view was that the people had to decide what kind of government they wanted.
The White Movement had already lost by the time he became the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of South Russia. First retreat from the Crimea, then Constantinople, and finally Serbia, to Sremski, Karlovci. Wrangel was a well-known and respected person. The general was considered the living image of the Russian emigration because he was perceived as its leader. He was married and had 4 children. His youngest son was born in 1922 when the family had already moved to Serbia.
A great mass of architects stayed here, especially the young ones, those who did not have a chance to express themselves in Russia. They started to do that here because they had a task. King Alexander was building a new capital for a new country. The old, small, narrow streets were not suitable for this new kingdom of Yugoslavia. This was a total reconstruction. Everything had to be demolished, and the city that we see now was created.
Alexander Karageorgievich came up with a plan for the construction of a completely new city. And fortunately for him, and for his plan, dozens of first-class Russian Emigré architects happened to be here at that moment. Perhaps the most famous one was Nikolai Krasnov. They even erected a monument to him here. He signed his works under the name Nikola Krasnov out of respect for his host country. This man lived a very interesting life. He was born in an ordinary peasant family and made a dizzying career thanks to his talents and hard work. He rose to the rank of court architect of Nicholas II. The Livadia Palace is one of his most famous works. In 1919, Krasnov left Crimea, wandered and lived in poverty in exile until he came to Belgrade and started receiving very lucrative orders directly from the king, as they say. He became a building inspector. The face of modern Belgrade is largely the work of Nikolai Krasnov.
This is the main building of the Serbian government today. The Prime Minister, who's head of the country, and his ministers work here. This building was built from scratch by Krasnov. He started the construction, but it was finished later. There is a figure of a woman holding a torch on top of the main dome. It is the symbol of Yugoslavia. "150 architects and about 100 civil engineers moved here. Apart from Krasnov, Vasily Androsov, Lukomsky, and Baumgartner worked here a lot as well. Baumgartner is the architect who designed the Defense Ministry building.
Nikolai Krasnov died here, right?
Yes.
Did he live in Belgrade for the rest of his life?
Yes. Many architects who moved here went further on to Western Europe or the USA in the 1930s.
Paris, Berlin?
Right. But Krasnov and other important architects stayed in Belgrade for the rest of their lives. Krasnov passed away in 1939. One of the city streets has been recently named after him, Nikolai Krasnov Street. It's not far from the church of St. Sava.
You remember that more than 40,000 Russian immigrants lived in Serbia at the peak. However, there was no parish church for the immigrants for quite a while. This was an important thing for an immigrant at that time, as you understand. Here is one of the most important cathedrals of Orthodox Belgrade, St. Mark's Cathedral. In 1924, Serbians allocated an ordinary barn for Russian Emigré priests to use and allowed them to build their own church at the back of this cathedral. The Russians started construction right away. The church was built according to the designs of the Russian architect Valery Stashevsky. They were in such a hurry because they were afraid that the priesthood of St. Mark's might change their minds despite their good relations with the émigrés. This cathedral was ready in just a couple of months. It still stands here in its original form. The surname of the parish priest at the Holy Trinity Church has been Tarasiev since the 1950s. At the beginning, it was Tarasiev, one of the first Russian immigrants. Then his son, also Tarasiev, became a priest. And now his grandson, Vitaly Tarasiev, is serving as priest here.
My grandfather's family lived in Mariupol during the revolution, where my great-grandfather and almost his entire family were killed, unfortunately. My grandfather came to the Balkans alone. He served in our church until his death in 1974. He always cared about people. He served, heard confessions, and communicated with parishioners. So people loved and revered him. They would always seek his advice. This was his life. This was his calling.
Did he miss Russia?
Of course. As far as I remember, this was the first generation of Russian refugees. They all lived out of suitcases because they hoped that something would change at some point and they would be able to return to their homeland. It's such a special feeling.
The problem of the Russian church was not whether it could be built next to St. Mark's Cathedral or not. The problem was two bells. How could we simultaneously ring the bells, even despite all our similarities? Nevertheless, Serbia supported us. Serbia allocated a part of its patriarchal palace in Sremski, Karlovci, in order to accommodate the Russian Orthodox Church abroad.
Why was Sremski, Karlovci such an important place on the map of Russian immigration? Because the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was formed here in 1921. It happened in this patriarchal residence. This is the residence of the then Serbian Patriarch Dimitrija. Metropolitan Anthony of Kiev also left Russia together with Wrangel's army. He became the leader of this church. The council was held here at the newly established church in 1921. At first it was declared submission to Patriarch Tikhon of Moscow, though. We remember that he was under terrible pressure from the Soviet government. He learned about the decision of the Karlovci Council, as it was called later, in hindsight, and he didn't approve it. Relations with Moscow were strained from the very beginning. They were finally severed in 1927 when the keeper of the patriarchal throne, Metropolitan Sergius, published his famous declaration in which he actually recognized Soviet rule. Of course, the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia could not accept and forgive this. From 1927, all contacts between the two branches of the Russian Church were severed until the late 1990s to the early 2000s. Putin had a hand in these two branches of the Russian Church formally uniting again. Now, the relations between the two branches are not that simple against the backdrop of the events in Ukraine. But that is another story. The Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia was the main and legitimate Russian church for the entire Western world, and the U.S. in particular. Later, its headquarters was satiated in New York. It owned a lot of real estate, monasteries, and land. It played a very significant role in general, and still does up to this day. One of the main things which King Alexander Karageorgievich gave both permission and money for is the Russian House. It was opened in 1933. This wasn't the main political center of Russian emigration. The Russian embassy, which was located on the other side of the Russian House, played the key role. Before 1940, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which was then called the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, did not recognize Soviet power, and the tricolor flag still flew over the old Russian embassy. A cultural and scientific center of Russian emigration was organized here in the Russian House. A scientific institute, a publishing house, and a gymnasium operated here. Numerous exhibitions were held in this building, so basically the entire educated segment of the Russian emigration flocked here. Up to 2,000 people a day would visit this place in the mid-1930s. Well, in addition to this cultural function, there was another one of great importance. It was an administrative and supervisory function. Perhaps that is why the opening of the Russian House was met not only with joy, but also with some irony, especially in the youth circles of the Russian emigration. For instance, the satirical magazine Buch welcomed the opening of the Russian House with the following squib: "Don't boast, silly Europe. We have our own culture. The Russian House, blini with caviar, Dostoevsky and Tolstoy."
Well, what else would they be so ironic about, except for the Russian House? They wouldn't dare to make fun of King Alexander, who supported and accepted them. If only they tried to make fun of the Serbian elite like that. No, people usually make fun of themselves, their own culture.
I think this ditty is always relevant. I've been trying to read it from the stage of the Russian house for a long time, but I didn't have a chance. The 19th anniversary of the Russian house is going to be pretty soon. I will break onto the stage and read it, and I will consider that my mission over.
You told me that your interest in Russian emigration largely began with the magazine Buch. What kind of magazine was it?
3 guys, friends, started an interesting satirical magazine. They were really sharp-tongued. They touched a raw and painful nerve of everyone they could reach. And yet they were holding on. Unfortunately, their fate was very sad. I stop at the 1930s. For example, one of the magazine's authors, Boris Ganovsky, became the editor of a collaborationist publication later during the war.
Remember this story. We'll get back to it and the events of World War II later in the next episodes. The future fate of the Russian house is amusing. It continued to operate even after the war, when the Red Army first came here, and Marshal Tito established socialism in Yugoslavia. And even when Tito quarreled with Stalin until the sparks flew and the relationship was completely ruined. Even when the Soviet embassy in Belgrade was closed, the Russian house still continued operating. It worked as the house of Soviet culture back then. Later, it logically became the Russian house again. It is within the jurisdiction of the Russian Federation today. The house belongs to the state Russian agency Rostrudnichestvo. Speaking about the agency, as I've already told you, many government officials and organizations are now afraid to do interviews with me because of my foreign agent status. But the Russian house, despite the fact that it is part of Rostrudnichestvo, said with great pleasure, come, because Russians have been welcomed here in the 1920s and are welcomed in the 2020s, regardless of their status.
Serious debates would take place in this hall. The time was turbulent. It was 1933. Up to the beginning of World War II, the left wing of the Russian emigration would clash with the far right wing here. The cream of the exiled Russian scientific society and the Russian intellectuals gathered here.
If we draw parallels with other centers of emigration, Berlin, Paris, Prague, and so on, Belgrade was a perfect, blissful picture when we speak about scientific emigration. There were more than 15 Russian Academy members and a huge number of professors working at the university. The university was also just being formed. There were no personnel yet.
33 Russian professors worked here at the University of Belgrade in 1921 to 1922. I found a good quote about this from the Serbian poet Milos Sremski.
Poor old shaggy Russian professors filled departments in universities in a foreign land with books, like the Greeks once did after the fall of Constantinople.
It is unlikely that Mr. Sremski could have personally seen the fall of Constantinople and those Greeks because it happened in the middle of the 15th century. However, the image is certainly impressive. We can instantly imagine those shaggy professors with piles of dusty books. This street was called King Milan Street in the 1930s. This was the main Russian street in Belgrade. The monument to Nicholas II was erected right here. This whole street was all about the Russian immigrants. There were plenty of Russian shops, Russian pharmacies, and Russian products. It was impossible to walk along this street in the 1930s at rush hour and not to hear Russian. By the way, the situation is the same now. You walk along it and hear Russian from time to time.
This is Varvara Kanyazeva's antique shop, but they didn't sell antiques here at all. Russians would live here for a month, 2, a year, a couple of years. Many of them wanted to leave at some point. When they were about to do that, they had very little money. but everything they had was valuable to some extent. In such conditions, they had to get rid of not only their previous place of residence, but also their beds, lockers, or wardrobes. Russians would go to such antique shops in that case. They didn't sell antiques there. They would sell household stuff that the Russians could leave.
You mean it was a consignment shop?
Yeah, kind of a consignment shop of that time. Its peculiarity was that mainly Russians would go there to sell, and Russians would come there to buy.
Russians too.
This was a market, and the market offered the hardest job in the whole town. I mean, peddler's job, peddling. And here we can see one such street peddler. He is walking around the market and offering something.
Can we assume that he was also a Russian immigrant?
Yeah, not just assume. We know for sure he was a Russian immigrant. This photograph is stored in the archive. It is labeled Russian peddler.
Probably he had already learned Serbian by this moment.
It depended on the immigrants' personal inclinations. Some of them did not speak Serbian well until the end of their life in their 60s and 70s. Some Russian immigrants spoke it perfectly by their early 20s, after just a couple of years.
Those emigrants were different. They did not live in a Russian-speaking microcosm. They immediately integrated into Serbian society. They lived in this society with all its advantages and disadvantages. They did not isolate themselves in their own community, be it literary, military, or ideological.
And of course, the most important part of Russian Belgrade at that time was the Russian restaurants. Yes, the Russians brought their restaurant culture to Belgrade. The famous Ruskaya Lira restaurant is located here in the very center of the city. The monument to Nicholas II and other important Serbian state buildings are just 100 meters away on this street. This is a new construction. Lira was located in the building that was here before. The owner of this place had previously owned restaurants in Petrograd and Moscow. Alexander Vertinsky, Pyotr Leshenko, Nadezhda Plevitskaya would perform here at the Ruskaya Lira. It's important to note that a good restaurant of that era always had live music. Since many first-class Russian performers would perform here, it was often not very clear whether this was a dinner or a concert in general for which you'd have to pay.
What did Belgrade fall in love with? It fell in love with balalaika players. Every decent Serbian restaurant had to have balalaika players. Famous Russian balalaika players became an integral part of Serbian restaurants.
The immigrant newspaper Bukh, which we've already mentioned, was rather ironic about the restaurant habits of the Russian immigrants. It described them on behalf of the Serbs and wrote, "Well, what did the Russians give us? Russian ballet, Russian salad, Russian balalaika, Russian aristocrats, Russian icons, and the custom of kissing women's hands." It's a nice tradition, the author continues, and what did we give the Russians? Raikia, the skill of swearing, I think they're mistaken on this, and civil service jobs with some salary. That's true. Well, also a dowry for those who married our girls.
We keep saying Russians are everywhere. We speak about Russian ballet and so on, but we do not know the fact that the Russians had a priority in comic books. Actually, European and Yugoslav comic books in particular, which were a serious part of the former, were created by Russian emigrants. They started to use the most serious topics quite freely. There is a comic book of The Silent Don by a Russian emigrant. It's a creative dialogue with Sholokov.
With Sokolov?
Right.
Oh wow, so Sokolov was there. He was here.
Sholokov was there. He was here, and he would draw his cartoons. Nevertheless, this was not some kind of crude satire. This is not a caricature. This is not a parody. This is a pretty serious discussion.
In what language were they written?
However, it is also an adventurous novel that is fun to read. They came out in Serbian. Moreover, they were almost immediately published in France and in Belgium.
Did it bring a good income?
It would bring in a fair return.
Meanwhile, Baron Wrangel was running out of money to support his army of thousands. He realized that it was impossible to keep it in its former state. He came up with a way out. This is Sremski, Karlovci, a town of several thousand inhabitants. There is a memorial plaque and a monument to Wrangel here. Take a look at how cool it is. It stands against the background of a large photo of Wrangel and his fellow officers. Here they mark the 5th anniversary of Wrangel's accession to the post of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. Since Wrangel was obsessed with the idea of an army that can't be dismissed because it would have to fight against the Bolsheviks again until the very end, another very important event for the history of Russian emigration took place here in Sremski, Karlovci. There was already quite a few veteran organizations in exile at that time. There was an organization of Gallipoli veterans. There was a veteran organization of the Ice March participants. There was plenty of them, but they were scattered. So Wrangel decided to unite them all into a single organization, which was created by his order on September 1, 1924. It was called the Russian All-Military Union, or RAMU. This was a very important abbreviation because the RAMU was often remembered in the USSR as one of the main counter-revolutionary anti-Soviet organizations.
Certainly the Soviets thought that this was a counter-revolutionary organization, and in fact they did engage in certain counter-revolutionary actions in Russia. But at heart he knew that the chances of going back and upending the Bolshevik Revolution were pretty slim. But he looked at it as saying, you've got all these, there are 2 million people left Russia, all over the world. And he viewed Rovs as a way of having a point of contact, something which people who are immigrants, who are, don't speak the language.
The idea was to keep the connections between these military men so that this army could be recreated in case something would happen. The departments of the All-Military Union were located in Paris, in Berlin, in Prague, in Bulgaria and Serbia. In all those places where there were some groups of former military personnel. The point was to maintain this unity and to get ready for this future campaign.
Which never took place. The expectation of return, the expectation of the upcoming spring campaign, the expectation that the Bolsheviks would stay in power for a short time. Those feelings that the Russian emigrants were filled with started to dissolve gradually. People were becoming more and more frustrated. As for Baron Wrangel, he stepped out of these doors of his house in Sremski, Karlovci for the last time and left for Belgium, for Brussels, in 1926. According to his official biography, he worked for some firm there. In fact, he did not give up until the very end, hoping that it would be possible to organize a new offensive against Bolshevik Russia. That was why he went to Belgium.
The main reason was that leading an organization from a peripheral country outside the center of Europe was difficult in practice. It was impossible to meet anonymously, either with German or with French or with English representatives. It was also impossible to maintain any contacts with any representatives of illegal organizations. It was a small town where everyone knew each other. If any person arrived there, they would immediately become visible.
In this sense, Brussels was a much more advantageous place, wasn't it?
Yes. On the one hand, he was in Western Europe between England, France, and Germany. On the other hand, he was not on the territory of any of these states. So he could maintain neutrality.
Did Brussels look like a new successful hub for Wrangel?
Yes, definitely.
In 1928 in Brussels, Wrangel suddenly fell ill with tuberculosis and quickly passed away. This is how this glorious chapter in the history of Russian emigration ended. There is an important and beautiful afterword. Wrangel asked to be buried in a fraternal Slavic country, which was obviously Serbia. Russian emigrants solemnly carried the coffin with his body from Brussels to Belgrade.
He died in Brussels and was brought here by train. Russian immigrants would come to the train along the entire route through the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, with reeds, flowers, and wept. They organized small demonstrations around the train in every city. When his body was taken to Belgrade, even its permanent residents were stunned. The inscription like this would appear in the newspapers. Do we live in a Serbian or in a Russian city? Not only the entire Russian community, but also Russians from all nearby places came here. Immigrants not only from Yugoslavia, but from other neighboring countries came to participate in this procession. They carried Wrangel's body across the city, from the railway station to the Holy Trinity Church. Russian immigrants lined up all along the way.
Tell me, please, it is known that the remains of General Denikin were reburied in Moscow.
Right.
Why was Wrangel not reburied?
Firstly, because his family, his descendants, did not agree with this.
My grandfather was buried basically with his troops in Belgrade. And for him to go back by himself, particularly when 50% of the population still thinks that Stalin was a great leader and all of this stuff, would be absolutely, he'd roll over in his grave.
After Wrangel had died, the Ramu was headed by General Alexander Kutepov. Under his leadership, the Union fully justified its status as an anti-Soviet organization, which was given to it in the USSR. Back in 1927, Kutepov managed to send several groups of militants there to carry out terrorist attacks in Bolshevik organizations. Most of the subversives were arrested. But one group, led by Viktor Larionov, succeeded to complete the task. On June 7, 1927, they bombarded the party club of the Leningrad Communist University with grenades. One person was killed, more than 20 were injured. This was one of the very few successful acts of sabotage committed by white emigrants on the territory of the USSR. The action was high profile but completely meaningless, if not harmful. None of the prominent Bolsheviks, especially the leaders, suffered. Of course, they were not going to appear at some insignificant party club on that day. But the explosion gave the Joint State Political Directorate an excellent pretext for new repressions. As a result, this cost Alexander Kutepov his life. He died in an attempted abduction by the Soviet Special Services, but they successfully kidnapped his Ramu head successor and delivered him to the State Security Department. Moreover, Russian emigrants themselves provided active assistance in this, those who were in the highest circles of the White Emigration army. How did it become possible? What arguments did Soviet intelligence make to these people? What made them act the way they did? How did the issue of a possible return to their homeland and cooperation with the Kremlin split the Russian emigrants? What were those who received permission from Moscow to return required to do? Why was Alexei Tolstoy called the Rent Count? How did the geography of Russian emigration in Europe change in the mid-1920s? Why did many emigrants aspire to go to Czechoslovakia and here to Germany? How did the rise of the Nazis affect Russian emigrants in Germany? How important was this dividing range for immigration? What were they about to do? To leave here or stay and try to sit it out? Or maybe collaborate with Hitler? What did the everyday life of Russian emigrants look like in Prague and Berlin, where, for example, Vladimir Nabokov lived for many years but did not learn German out of principle and hated Germany all the time? For what? And how did an ordinary Russian emigrant manage to settle in the Imperial Palace here in Bonn? We'll talk about all this in the next episodes of our series about the White Emigration. Subscribe to the channel. See you soon.